So welcome everyone. I'm Maura McGinty-Kloss and I am the NAA's Outreach and Communications Manager. I'm delighted that you're joining us today. The purpose of NAA webinars is not just to convey information, but to engage natural area professionals on topics of interest that highlight the emerging science, methodologies, and best practices. If there's a topic that's of interest to you for a future webinar, please don't hesitate to let us know. We are constantly programming and we try to keep our programming fairly flexible so that we can be responsive to issues as they come forward for us. And I encourage you to participate in this webinar by posting comments, questions in the chat function. Go ahead and post them to both panelists and attendees, and I'll be monitoring those, and then we will be doing Q&A at the end. And I will be asking as many questions as possible. So I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. As a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to the support and advancement of natural areas professionals, we are a community that identify challenges and develop solutions and share critical findings that advance the practice in conservation, preservation, and restoration of nature. And we do that through networking and opportunities to collaborate. So for over 40 years, NAA has supported your work in natural areas management. We have our Natural Areas Journal, which is a quarterly peer-reviewed publication that has the latest science, as well as Stewardship in Action field workshops, which we're really excited are going to be going in person. We, of course, with COVID, we're not able to have them in 2020, but our first one is in September in Southern Virginia. So keep an eye out for those programs as they get posted to our website. We also host the State Natural Areas Program Roundtables. Our next ones are in August and November, and this is a unique opportunity for state areas, land management professionals to come together. We usually have a particular topic that we're talking about. We bring in an expert for a presentation, but then we encourage you to come to the table. Are there issues that are a challenge to you? Do you need advice from another state or from someone else? And the discussions are great. So I encourage you to also look for those and register for those as they come up. We are also planning a Natural Areas Conference. We have one every fall. In September 2022, we'll be in Duluth, Minnesota in person. But for 2021, just to be on the cautious side, we are going to be doing a virtual conference again. It'll be a one-day program, and we're going to focus on fire and invertebrate conservation. So we hope you'll keep an eye out on our website to register for that. And then, of course, we offer monthly webinars like this one. So just to quickly say, if you're not a member, please consider joining us. After this webinar, you will get a membership offer. You're going to get access to the archives for 7 days. And during that time, you will be able to watch the recording of this webinar, as well as other webinars that we've offered. However, with the 7-day trial, if you choose to join, we will credit the $29 to your membership, and essentially you can join for $50. So we hope that you'll consider doing that. And that way, all of your webinars as you go forward are part of your membership. You no longer have to pay. So I just want to tell you quickly of the webinars that are coming up in July and August and November. So in July, we're doing Protecting Rare and At-Risk Species, Tools to Collect Meaningful Data with Limited Resources. And this is a webinar that includes 2 different authors from our Natural Areas Journal who wrote on a related topic and are coming together to talk about this. Then in August, we're having priority species list to restore desert tortoise and pollinator habitats in the Mojave Desert and shrublands. Again, this was a journal author, so and I believe the article is open access, so you might check that out on our website. And then in November, we're having Using Informed Plant Selection to Restore Pollinator and Songbirds in Human-Dominated Landscapes. So that's what's coming up, and you can go to our website to register. So now I'm going to take a moment to introduce our speaker today. We are really excited to be hosting our speaker today, Glenn Juday. Glenn is a PhD. He's a professor emeritus at Forest Ecology and Natural Resources in the Environmental Department and director of the Tree Ring Laboratory in the Institute of Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Extension at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. So he's coming from a long way through the miracle of virtual programming. He has taught graduate and undergraduate level courses in conservation biology, wilderness management, natural resource decision-making, and tree ring analysis for over 3 decades. His research specialties include natural controls over biodiversity, climate variability and change, tree ring studies, sustaining biodiversity and forest management, and forest development following wildfire and forest harvest. Prior to his academic career, Glenn was a research scientist in the USDA Forest Service at the Institute of Northern Forestry in Fairbanks and from 1977 to 1981. He also served as the Alaska Ecological Reserves Coordinator for 15 years and was responsible for establishing or proposing 80 research natural areas totaling nearly 670,000 acres. He was a senior investigator in the NSF-supported Bonanza Creek Long-Term Ecological Research Site in Central Alaska from 1990 until 2017. And he has served as the president of the Natural Areas Association from 1985 until 1988. So Glenn, welcome.
Thank you, and good morning from Alaska. Okay, so what I'd like to do is go from the specific or particular to the general. That is, drawing lessons from the boreal forest region pose a general dilemma that I believe all of us face who are doing natural areas work. And I'm going to call upon you to start a dialogue here that I hope can result in something constructive for the work that we all do. If we look at a map of North America, it's pretty obvious that as you go to the north, the human population density and impact, of course, decrease. And that area is occupied primarily by the boreal forest. North of that, tundra and even some glaciers and in Baffin Island and Greenland and very rocky, barren places. But a moderately productive ecosystem that is one of the largest in the world occupies that belt across northern North America. I've drawn this map from an article that if you want to get further into these issues, it's just last year, so it's a pretty up-to-date review of the state of conservation in North America's boreal forest. This region, the boreal forest of both Eurasia and North America, happen to be one of the 5 intact forest regions of the world. And this is a map from that same article, although I think I'd quibble a little bit with how they've depicted the Alaska and the Northwest North American boreal region. This article from a few years ago had a quantitative scale of human impact across the face of the earth with 10 categories, and then a scale of 1 to 10 for each of those categories of human impact. And I think it more adequately represents the real situation. So Northwestern North America does have some corridors breaking it up into human impacted strips, but it's not, it's largely intact region. Here's another article that's fairly recent and gets into the issues of boreal forest health and global change. Now, you might think, well, low impact, human impact, low human population density, no problems, right? Well, actually, the boreal forest is one of the parts of the world that faces some major challenges from global climate change. It's one of the world's largest biomes, in addition to forest biome, but just biome. 2/3 of it has traditionally been under the management, some management system for usually wood production. And increasingly, global policy and science is focusing on the boreal region because of its importance in climate regulation, which I'll highlight in just a moment. And the speed and the magnitude of what the changes that are happening there are really quite impressive. The authors of the article that I'm citing here called for greater focus on boreal forests in these international forums that look at priorities for global conservation attention. And actually, there has been a trend to put aside this notion that, well, it's all, there's few people, it's all protected, there's no problems. There are challenges. Here's some graphics pulled from that article, and I draw your attention to A in the graphic here, which is the coincidence of permafrost and the boreal forest. The reason the permafrost is so important is it's a massive storehouse of carbon that was removed from the atmosphere and has been in storage and in the frozen state. And it's equivalent essentially to a greater amount than the total that is in the atmosphere. So the movement or the change in, if there's any reduction in the storage of that carbon, we have a major, major challenge on our hands. All right, if we look at Alaska, here are the large major federal congressionally established conservation areas. Over half of the acreage of the National Wildlife Refuge System and major units of the National Park System. Some up in the mountains and glaciers and that sort of thing, but some including significant pieces of the boreal forest. A few years ago, I was asked by the National Science Foundation, the Arctic Sciences Division, to just kick off a series to review how our thinking about climate change and how the awareness of that issue developed scientifically. And so I did an article for them in their publication called Witness the Arctic. And I took as the challenge, how was a guy whose job was ecological reserves and conservation getting pulled into climate change? Well, when I began work as ecological reserves coordinator, our focus was, because of the large extent of undisturbed ecosystems, our purpose was dominated by science. Okay, the research natural areas really did have a research and education motivation for them. Wasn't so much that these bounded properties will represent a major contribution to the survival of the species or ecosystems. So obviously, we wanted to know, are they healthy? Are they changing? Are there any external threats to them? At that point, there was awareness of and concerns about things like acid deposition, et cetera. And one of the issues was climate change. So we wanted to know, we wanted to have a representative system, and we wanted to know enough about them that if the climate changed, we would see what some of the effects would be. This is the network of research natural areas in Alaska. As of now, we sort of stopped working in a focused way using this land designation, but I believe it's going to become more active in the near future. And you can see there are a number of them across central Alaska, both state and federal lands. And I was involved in selecting these and establishing most of those in the boreal forest. Well, because of this early start, ecological reserves, scientific focus, that's what we're going to use them for. And this idea that, well, what about climate change? Well, it's a pretty obscure field, okay? It wasn't being taken all that seriously as an immediate prospect by the scientific community, but there were a few of us who did. And so one of the first things I did early on was to do a major review of the science and thinking and projections associated with climate change, And I wrote this article in our school's, I guess, magazine. It had a very large circulation in the natural resource community. But so you can see in the box on the lower right, here are some of the hypothesized consequences of what if there was global warming. All right, rising sea level, thawing permafrost, retreating glaciers, etc. And again, these seemed like far off prospects, probably nothing that would really directly influence me in my career, but I thought it was important and I wanted to bring that forward. Just the last couple of days, I discovered something and I thought I'd just share this with you. This is a joint statement of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Panel that deals with biodiversity, who came together and issued this statement and publication, the link is down below, in advance of the G7 meeting, the leaders of the group of 7 nations that have just been meeting. And they made this statement: climate change and biodiversity loss are 2 of the most pressing issues of the Anthropocene. They are largely addressed in their own domains. And basically, this was a call for, well, let's bring these 2 fields together. This is really important. And it just it felt like validation for something that happened to me about 40 some years ago. And it is, so let me give you a real world example of right away how it affected me in the research natural area work that I was doing. I became a member of the planning team for the Chugach National Forest Land and Resource Management Plan in order to produce the research natural area component of it. So we proposed 10 research natural areas for the Chugach National Forest. One of them was Columbia Glacier, Granite Cove, 13,000 acre area that was at the terminus of a glacier that was projected to undergo drastic retreat in the next few years. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful opportunity then to explore. Well, here we are in the early stages of the retreat. The ice cliff that you see there, it's hard to convey the scale of what you're looking at in this picture, but it's miles and miles and miles. The Eiffel Tower is about the height of the ice cliff in the picture here. And so this is where the glacial retreat has already been underway for some time, about 15 years. Now here's just 10 years later. We're talking about a massive loss of ice mass that broke off and floated away. Actually, it was icebergs from Columbia Glacier that diverted the Exxon Valdez that led to the oil spill in Alaska. So the breakup of that glacier was a major event. If we look at it from a satellite image, here we see on the left 1986 versus 2019, and you can see the glacier has retreated about 15 miles, and across an ice front of 3 to 5 miles wide and across a depth from 2,000 foot above sea level to 1,000 feet below sea level. So we're talking about a huge change on the face of the earth. And yes, we did have a research natural area that went through that process of change, and it's proving to be a really interesting and useful area. All right, now the interest in the subject began to pick up. So I became part of a team that organized a conference on potential effects of carbon dioxide-induced climate changes in Alaska. This is the first that we know of that took a regional approach and posed a serious question about, well, what would be different in the ecosystems, in the economy, in the life of people, as if climate change actually did happen. And just to give you an idea of how early it was in the process, Charles Keeling was one of our invited participants. And Charles Keeling was the originator of the Keeling curve that you see here, the Mauna Loa observatory record of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And we just called him up and said, well, could you come to our conference in Alaska? And he said, well, sure, I'm not all that busy. I don't so now, of course, it's just a whole industry, and thousands of people are involved. But it was early days back then. It is sobering, though, to look at the date of our conference. Carbon dioxide concentration would be about 342 parts per million. The latest figure I just pulled down was about 419 parts per million. So quite a bit of change has accumulated in just that time. Now, this is a map of the global temperature anomalies, departures from normal, across a flat map projection of the world. And I always do this for talks on this subject. I always include it in the presentation, and I just pick the 365 days from near the time of the meeting and back in time. And it's always the same pattern. We see a major red zone across the far north and the far south. So the polar regions are, in other words, warming dramatically faster than the rest of the planet. And that, of course, is one of the major and early predictions of the theory of greenhouse gas warming. In the conference that we had, I analyzed the Alaska climate record, and I used in particular the long-running University Experiment Station, which is on our agricultural and forestry experiment farm here on the campus. A couple of years ago, we were recognized by the World Meteorological Organization as one of the handful of climate stations around the world that have more than a century of high quality, uninterrupted data from the same location. So you may think that, wow, there's some really old climate records. There's not that many that are the same location, uninterrupted. One of the conclusions that I made in my article examining the Alaska climate record was, well, if, as expected, CO2 effect begins to overwhelm the natural range of climate variability between now and the end of the century, Alaska would experience a stair-step increase in temperatures as part of that high latitude position on the Earth in which a greater and more rapid warming is happening, the peaks of which would reach unprecedented highs. Okay, so here's a smoothing treatment, a 5-year running mean of this University Experiment Station Fairbanks mean annual temperature record. And I've drawn a dashed line there where the date of the article that I wrote. And there was an Arctic-wide peak in about 1940, depends on where you are in the far north. But again, the specific projection at the time was a stair-step increase in temperatures, the peaks of which would reach unprecedented highs. And that's exactly what happened. There was the Arctic-wide peak and then a period of a couple of decades of moderate cooling. The new peak in the late 70s, and then steady elevated temperatures at that level. And now we're at an unprecedented peak, a third stage in the development of those. Now that's one station with a very long record. Here's all the first order stations in Alaska combined, and you can see a very strong warming trend, really accelerating from the year 2000 onward. So we're well underway in a process of change. You can see geographically here where that magnitude of change is greatest. It's the Arctic Ocean that the sea ice cover is decreasing rapidly, then the interior, then it's harder, of course, to warm up the entire North Pacific Ocean, but that is happening as well. So in southern and southeast Alaska, not as great a magnitude of warming. So let's focus on the boreal forest, the central interior region of Alaska. Now, what effects should we expect as a result of warming? Well, one thing that everybody projected immediately was, well, it should burn more. And of course, we experienced that. And then a couple of decades later, the Western North America, Canada, and the US have been experiencing that as well. But it was predicted and experienced earlier in Alaska. Here now is maybe a second wave phenomenon that's in the increase in acres reburned. So within a 40-year period, one fire and then another fire. So the fire occurs, forest regenerates, and then that regeneration is consumed in a fire. And that produces a different effect. It produces an impoverishing effect on the flora, because the amount of time for recovery is not sufficient for many species, especially trees, to become reproductively mature. So you kill and burn everything that reproduced, and it's don't give it enough time to reach maturity, and you've dramatically diminished or eliminated those species. And that, of course, now is occurring on a widespread basis in Alaska. Here's another way of looking at the unprecedented nature of the change. Here's a two-axis graph across the horizontal line, the mean July temperature, and the vertical is annual precipitation. This is a USGS professional paper, and should be freely available from the USGS. What you could think of this as, define the geographic distribution limits of white spruce. Okay, that's a polygon or series of polygons in North America. Now, find every single climate station within that polygon. Okay, now find the mean July temperature and the annual precipitation for that station. Okay, and make a black dot for it. Okay, so what we have in essence is the realized niche of white spruce, and there it is. Okay, here's the spooky thing. The up until the lowest you can grow the species in precip across North America is 280 millimeters of precip. But starting with July temperatures of 15.5 C, you have to add more water than 280 millimeters to be able to grow the species. And the temperature in Fairbanks exceeded 15.5, is gone. The annual precip at Fairbanks is exactly 280. The temperature now is greater, so we're outside the envelope in which this species has traditionally been found in North America. Whoa, that's spooky. So you would expect to see something like, well, major effects on tree species, especially at the particularly dry years. Well, this is one where this isn't a fall picture, it's a midsummer picture, and the trees are simply drying and crinkling up and losing their chlorophyll because of acute drought injury. And because this was right on the campus, even the researchers here could not ignore it. So this is the last symptom that the tree goes through before it dies. So we nearly killed a lot of trees in Boreal Alaska simply from the acute dryness. Now here's a research project that we did, I was involved in and led to trying to look at what's happening at the larger scale. So this is a map of mean July temperatures, or maximum temperatures across the state. So we have this really warm interior region, and here on the western coast of Bering Sea, much, much cooler midsummer temperatures. So we sampled trees all the way across along the river floodplains, white spruce trees, all the way out to the tree limit. Took us a couple of years to do all of the trips to get all of the information, and the Kuskokwim River down here, which is another major North American river. What we found was this. All of the trees in this warm, dry interior region are what we call negative responders. The warmer it is, the less they grow. The cooler the summer, the more they grow. Then there was a zone of mixed responses, and then the positive responders. The warmer it is, the more they grow. The cooler it is, the less they grow. So this is a classic, the negative response is a classic drought stress problem. And that's exactly what's limiting the growth of these trees here. And the trees out here barely survived. It's cold and almost insufficient heat sums to be able to grow the trees, but you warm it a little bit and then they respond very positively. Here is from that entire project, then all the positive responders and all the negative responders, their actual rate of growth, not their change in rate of growth, warmer grow less, but actual growth. You can see that the negative responders traditionally grew more than the positive responders because they were on more productive sites, okay? But there was an historic, this is rate of growth decade by decade going back to 1780. So each decade's growth is depicted here. And right at the time that the Alaska temperatures started to increase dramatically, there was an historic reversal, and the positive responders are now growing at twice the rate of the negative responders. Now, the article that I've cited down below, and I put in blue here, the article title includes our conclusion about this result. This result confirms that early stage biome shift is underway. The interior region is becoming systematically less suitable for the growth of the trees, and the western region that used to be too cold is becoming systematically more suitable. Now, that was partly because precipitation stayed constant. Now, especially as we remove the sea ice from the Arctic Ocean, we're experiencing a series, we don't know how much longer it may go on, or if it's permanent, but there's been a 40% increase in precip averaged across Alaska. So we have a major change underway at the level of the biome shift. One of the, here's an article, it's a chapter in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. It's available free of charge. There's a link at the bottom where you can obtain this, any of the chapters. It's a huge piece of work. And it was one of those circumpolar global-like assessments. I was lead author in that chapter on forests, land management, and agriculture. And what the charge to us included an analysis of the global circulation model climate scenarios, the 2002 era. So we're talking about 20-year-old global climate projections and models. And I thought I would just analyze for you here the actual experience compared to the projections that we had at the time. So here we had 5 scenarios that we we're told to look at and project what would the boreal forest be like if something like these 5 different scenarios occurred. That's the 5 scenario mean. And then I've chosen the CCC, that's the Canadian Climate Center, one of the most aggressive warming scenarios, and just compared them. If the bars, this is month by month, the actual over the last 20 years versus what the climate scenario said might happen. Okay, and you can see that there are some, if the bar is above the line, that means the recorded temperatures that actually occurred were warmer than the scenario, and below the line, colder than what the scenario said. Averaged out over the whole year, it was amazingly accurate. 0.14 C difference between what the scenario said for the Fairbanks climate versus what actually occurred. And one of the more lower or more moderate warming scenarios was the most inaccurate. So in essence, what we're seeing is that strong warming at the upper range of the scenarios that we used 20 years ago has actually occurred. Now, this is another way of depicting the same information. I extracted the temperatures that control the growth of white spruce. Okay, mean monthly temperatures. That's the TI, temperature index for WSP, for white spruce, for that negative responder population. Okay, and then the solid red line depicts that actual temperature from the beginning of the record in 1910 through recently. And notice it's an inverted scale. It goes from low to high. Well, why? Because we're plotting it against ring width index, or detrended ring width, in green. So the warmer it is down on this axis, then the less the trees grow. And you see the two curves are matching pretty good. In fact, very, very impressively. So warming is driving down the growth of the population of spruces from near or above 1 millimeter per year to almost half that. And the scenarios projecting forward, continuing the warming downward here, okay, drive the temperature band to a level that it appears would not allow the white spruce trees to grow at all. So that's another reason that I felt confident enough to say we have a biome shift already underway, and the early stages of it have appeared. This is a summary figure on the impacts and magnitude of effects that we projected in 1998 for climate impacts on the boreal forest. Okay, now some of them we're not certain about. Some we have some degree of confidence, or had at the time, and some we had high confidence. Some of those impacts were high magnitude, and some of those impacts high magnitude and negative, and some of those impacts were positive impacts. So obviously the place where you'd want to focus is high confidence, high impact, negative effects. So were we correct in the 1, 2, 3, 4 there? Widespread insect-caused tree mortality, check. Earlier springs and later falls deepen the deficit of effective precip, check. More frequent and widespread defoliation of aspen, birch, and tamarack, check. Drought-induced tree mortality and tree regeneration failure, yes, we're actually starting to see that as well. So our projections were fairly accurate. Most of the mistakes were additional effects we just failed to identify. One of the other chapters in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment then was Principles of Conserving the Arctic's Biodiversity. Okay, and I was a part of the author team of that. Now, we all know that biodiversity comes in three principal forms: the genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecological or landscape diversity. So what I want to do is drill down now into a lesson from geologic history. Climate change itself is not new. The boreal forest is a collection of survivors of major past periods of climate change. And Alaska is a particular center of genetic diversity of boreal species. So let's take a look at this publication available on the link below from a NASA project. Let's take these are time steps: 21,000 years ago, 18,000 years ago, 15 and 12,000 years ago. Okay, so let's follow the pollen abundance of spruce in North America. And here's in the light blue, the ice sheet over North America. If you traveled back 21,000 years ago, where would you find the boreal forest? In the Ozarks, Missouri and Arkansas. Okay. If you traveled back 18,000 years ago, where would you find it? Southern Appalachians in southern Ohio. Okay. If you travel back 15,000 years ago, where would you find the boreal forest? Well, from Washington, D.C. out to Iowa. Okay. And then 12,000 years ago, well, now it's moved into the Canadian prairie provinces. All right. And now let's add one additional dimension to this. You have to understand how Alaska was much, much different than the rest of North America in terms of the ice sheet. It essentially was not glaciated in the interior portion. And the Bering Land Bridge was not some skinny little thing between the two, across the Bering Straits, but a huge, broad shelf extending way south. So we had two unglaciated refugia here where the plants could hang out. If we look now, and here's the article citation at the bottom, if you wish to follow. This is work by Lynn Anderson and Fengsheng Hu. Modern white spruce haplotype diversity, genetic diversity, has two centers in North America, one in Alaska and one in South Central Canada. And gene types, the diversity of gene types, decrease in both directions as you travel out from those two centers. That exactly matches the refugium in Alaska, the refugium south of the ice sheet in North America, and then the selection of a few gene types that managed to migrate as the ice sheet retreated. Okay. That same principle applies more broadly across North America. And here's another article that I've cited: Glacial Refugia and Modern Genetic Diversity of 22 Western North American tree species. Major lessons for us here from this result. If we reconstruct the glacial refugia for these 22 North American tree species at the glacial maximum, then there's a geographic coherence to them, and you can even put some names on them there. In Alaska, again, there's much of the refugium got flooded as sea level rose, but those gene types migrated and are now found in this nearest position to where the refugium was. And in central Alaska, has simply expanded out. What here's the abstract from that article, and it's a great relevance to us in the natural areas field. We find that species with strong genetic differentiation into subspecies, okay, that's genetically rich populations, had widespread and large glacial refugia, whereas species with restricted refugia show no differentiation among populations. They're genetically uniform, despite being common over a wide range of environments today. So they may have a big geographic distribution today, but they're genetically impoverished. This is a classic population bottleneck effect. All right. The same applies in other environments in North America. For example, the shrinkage of the freshwater lakes in the US Intermountain West. The Great Lakes of the West at the height of the Ice Age would have been a wonderful place to live. Great climate, lots of freshwater, lake recreation, and then these islands that fostered the development of genetic differentiation that in some cases went all the way to speciation. Then the climate warmed and became arid, and now we have isolated freshwater streams and springs with globally rare species in them, and the sky islands of the West. Okay, so what's the lesson? 3 key climate change processes have produced the loss of genetic diversity in the past: constricting the geographic range of species, forcing rapid long-distance migrations, and then confronting the migrating species with risks, such as the failure to find suitable environments along the migratory route. So that's the analogy that we can use for the current situation that we face. The climate is changing rapidly. Species are going to have to move. New environments that are suitable for them are emerging, but they're not in the same places that they used to be. Genetic impoverishment has already occurred as a result of human direct impact. Additional and possibly fatal impoverishment genetically or demographically could happen to those species, and we're the managers who are supposed to deal with that and help solve that problem. So our tendency to believe that the past is the guide to the future is a questionable assumption. Our completely understandable and in many cases justifiable reluctance to allow new species to appear in our managed habitats has to be at least reconsidered. And will ecologists be, in practice, be climate change skeptics? That is not becoming a factor preventing the adjustments that are required. The other major factor, and the one I want to focus on at the end here for you, is we have a whole thick body of laws and policies at state levels, at agency policy levels, at national level that talk about don't change, keep things the same. Whatever you do in your management, don't be an influence for changing what is there and what you were given as your initial condition. Whether it's a state constitution, like the sustained yield principle in Alaska's constitution, the federal statute, like the FLPMA, the Federal Land Management Policy Act, or the Forest Service's Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, or National Forest Management Act. In essence, we have to recharter our management of natural areas to reflect the realities that are emerging. And we have to do it really carefully. I'm not a radical on these issues, okay? Sober and evidence-based. Okay, so let's think about our ecological management as kind of management regimes And we could think of ecological intactness scale from really messed up systems that humans have really beat up to pristine wilderness, okay? And follow a curve downward there. And we could think of the intensity of management that's required. So a really beat up area is going to require intensive intervention in management techniques of restoration, of all kinds of monitoring and et cetera. And if you have a system that's ecologically intact, then you just do custodial management at fairly low cost. So our ecological management regimes are identifiable positions along this axis here in this two-axis intersection. So our classic model of natural areas management has been assemble and maintain large contiguous reserves. Good, let's do it. We need to keep doing more of that. Sustain optimum standing populations of wildlife and less common species so that we don't cause genetic impoverishment. Allow dynamic processes to occur to renew systems and remove or drastically diminish invasive non-native species. However, there are limitations. The historical past is maybe not a good guide to the future. Assuming that local genotypes are the best adapted, that's pretty questionable as well. We need to move from an emphasis on species to include, not ignore, but include genes. Okay, and we need to focus on the repair of direct anthropogenic damage or destruction. That's what we've always been doing. But we have to then also look at transboundary influences like climate change. So we need a new mandate for our management. I don't know, I don't have a good suggestion for a name, and I'm looking for creative thinking from you folks, but it's going to include a climate dynamic component. And it's going to have to include these elements. We need to superintend the process of climate adjustment. If it's simply the natural migration of species, great, but we need to at least monitor that and understand that it's happening. We need to consider, and in some cases, provide migratory assistance. Well, we've already done that, for example, in restocking wildlife in habitats where they've been extirpated. All right, that's assisted migration. We need to overcome migratory barriers. Novel environments that are emerging are going to squeeze species through some really tough choke points, including human occupancy of the landscape, that we've got to overcome. We need to avoid potential demographic or genetic bottlenecks, like those that were so devastating during the last global warming. And we need to really focus on sustaining genetic diversity. So I propose that people in the natural areas profession provide the leadership in defining and framing a new mandate for our management. Okay, and what is our overall goal? Will it be simply the survival of all species, regardless of artificialization? Is it to recreate familiar ecosystems that we feel comfortable in managing? Is it to move species to optimum environments that they are best adapted to now, but to keep doing it forever and ever? Is it to keep populations of the most important functional species, so we have the maximum amount of carbon uptake and storage or something like that? Is it to maintain gene types, which would mean it's going to skew our management toward finding and providing for the rare genes? Or is it to, okay, so all of these elements are going to be part of it, and we need this new mandate. I'll just close with a quote here from John Henry Newman, one of the more famous figures of 19th century Britain. Well, he's a clergyman, and But in the great tradition of Darwin, for example, whose dad was a clergyman, was a naturalist as well. And he said, this is 7 years before Darwin, he made this incredibly insightful observation. We have familiar experience of the order, the constancy, the perpetual renovation of the material world which surrounds us. Frail and transitory, as is every part of it, restless and migratory, as are its elements, never ceasing, as are its changes, still it abides. It is bound together by a law of permanence. It is set up in unity. And though it is ever dying, it is ever coming to life again. Dissolution does but give birth to fresh modes of organization, and one death is the parent of 1,000 lives. So that's the end. I really commend to you, take this challenge seriously. Think about this new mandate we need. Think about the terms we could describe it. I really encourage you, join the Natural Areas Association, become a part of this effort. Let's organize ourselves. Let's bring this forward to the policymaking arena, and let's recharter our management of the natural areas and the natural world with this new mandate, and really provide the leadership that's needed in this area. Thanks very much.
Well, Glenn, thank you so much. That was really an amazing presentation. I know I learned an amazing amount in seeing the detail of your research. So thank you. We are almost right at 1 o'clock. I don't have a whole lot of questions coming in, I think because it's just so much to absorb. But if somebody has one or two, I'd be happy to ask them. But in the meantime, are you willing to share your PowerPoint? Can we post it to people that are registered? Okay, so so know everyone that the links and all the things that Glenn did cite as the course of his presentation will be available to you for those of you who paid for 7 days, and then for members as long as you want access to them. I do have one question, Glenn. Let's go ahead and ask it. Are you aware of any monitoring plans that have been developed to truly monitor natural migrations of tree species?
The closest we can come to that, at least, and again, my experience and background showing here, is in the Boreal world, is the Canadian system of provenance trials of tree species. A provenance trial is where you collect all the genetic varieties of a given species across its entire range, and you plant them in test plantations all across the range. And so sometimes then you will see the better performance of a non-native genotype in a given environment simply because it's currently out of equilibrium, and the gene types currently present haven't yet migrated, and something from somewhere else does better. They have wrapped that up into a kind of an assessment. It was done for commercial timber purposes, but initially it was set up for that. But it's been adapted now for a climate change purpose, and seems to be pretty useful.
Okay, great. Great. And just to say again, I did have the question, will the PowerPoint be made available? Yes. And as you know from the presentation, Glenn did provide the links within that PowerPoint. So it is 1 o'clock. We do need to wrap up. This is a topic that it's going to take us a long time to deal with, but I appreciate, Glenn, that you've sort of helped shape the questions and the things that we need to be thinking about, and calling us all together as a group of natural areas professionals to make a difference. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our July webinar. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.